with this Wisconsin Supreme Court. Oh my goodness. NYC, Chicago. Cool.
South Florida. All places warmer than here.
DC. It's beautiful. I'm dialing in from San Francisco. It's been really sunny and gorgeous today here.
Okay. I'm like admitting people checking the Facebook, but I think we're good to go. I'm just going to keep my eye out on this, the waiting room to make sure that I admit everyone. But I see, hi Jessica from Brooklyn. I'm so excited to be having this conversation. I know that Karen and I have some really deep conversations, so I wanted us to go ahead and get started so that we make sure that we have enough time to discuss everything. So the first thing that I wanted to say is just, if you feel compelled to share, you can take yourself off of mute, but we just ask that you keep yourself on mute so that we don't hear that playback that you sometimes hear when multiple people have their sound on. Okay, admit. So just to share a little bit about me, I know some of you may not be familiar with me. My name is Janice. I host the Diversity Dinner Dialogue. I was doing them mostly in person in New York City, and I've had one in Richmond, Virginia, but with everything that happened with COVID, I moved them to a virtual format, which is exciting because as you can see, we have people joining from all different parts of the country and the world. And so I think it's important that we keep this conversation going and have these conversations. A lot of the work that I do, I've realized that part of the reason why things like bias and racism continues to happen is that we don't have these conversations. People are really, really scared, especially when it comes to race, to engage in these conversations. So I'm really glad that Karen and I could come together to have this really, really important discussion about collective liberation for Black women and white women. So I do diversity and inclusion consulting. I am also a professor. I teach courses in management, and I also do a lot of writing on diversity and inclusion. So that's a little bit about me for those of you who are on the call who are not familiar with me. And Karen, did you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Our mission is to inspire the anti-racist generation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think at first you were on mute, so we didn't
talking?
catch the first part of what you said.
Oh, okay, yeah. So
yeah.
My name is Karen Fleshman. 5 years. Can you hear us? Okay. Keep going. Okay, yes. My name is Karen Fleshman. 5 years ago, I founded Racy Conversations. Our mission is to inspire the anti-racist generation. And we're a workshop facilitation company. We do workshops in workplaces all throughout the country on bias, migration, allyship, sexual harassment. And now I'm kind of transitioning my focus because I'm writing a book, White Women, We Need to Talk, Doing Our Part to End Racism. That's going to come out in 2021. So I'm going to start to shift more focus toward reaching and teaching white women. Recently, I had a tweet about Karen, #Karen, that went viral. And then I got named by Reddit Common Sense Karen because I said, Karen isn't a slur. It's a stereotype we earned by behaving like monsters, voting for monsters, and raising monsters. and our own behavior is so atrocious to everyone except ourselves that our own children are making videos and memes mocking us. So I really hope that Karen can become a mirror for white women to look at and not look away from, but something that we can use to guide behavior change and reclaim Karen by changing our behavior.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your brief intro. So let me just say, I see that Glenn, who is the tech expert, just said, if any of you are open to it, feel free to shut off your video. I think that's what's slowing down the bandwidth, because I'm noticing it's doing a lot of freezing, which I haven't encountered that problem before. But if any of you are willing to or open to turning off your videos, unless you have something to contribute, I think that would help with the speed a little bit. So thank you for that, Glenn. So I wanted to, before we go ahead and get started, I wanted to share a quote that I thought was really relevant and necessary to set the tone for this conversation. So Audre Lorde has a very popular quote that I love to reference. And in the quote, she said, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." So I think that after thinking about this quote, it sort of highlights and shines a really bright light on the fact that if women are expecting to achieve any sort of liberation, that will not be achieved and accomplished until all women can come together. And I think that when it comes to particularly white women and Black women, there are a lot of barriers to our collective liberation. And I have to first say, I am one Black woman. I don't speak for all Black women, of course. What I'm going to be sharing and discussing is things that I've spoken with other Black, Indigenous people of color, women of color in particular. So what I'm bringing to this discussion is just my opinions as one person. So I want to first preface this by saying I don't represent every single Black woman. But so the first thing that I think we should really speak on and touch on is the fact that I think as a Black woman, it's a little bit frustrating for me when we have this conversation of gender equity. When we have the gender equity conversation, it seems like for Black, Indigenous women of color, the focus is not on us when we talk about gender equity. So I wanted to ask you or open up the conversation to anyone, not just Karen, but how do you think we can shift from focusing on white women when we have the gender equity conversation to talking about all women? Because I think that in speaking with my Black sisters and my women of color sisters, it seems like our experiences are kind of left out of the conversation when we talk about gender equity. So I think that part of the frustration stems from that. Gender equity does not often include women of color, indigenous women, and Black women. So how do we shift the conversation, or has anyone had experiences with this where you're kind of in charge of or asked to spearhead these conversations, but you find that they're focusing specifically on just white women?
Janice, I would love to chime in. First of all, it's so great to finally meet you. And Karen, I've been following you. So I do work at an institution where there's a lot of white women in higher education, and our president is actually a white woman. And so one thing I'm addressing to really look at racism is calling out privilege, that you are a white woman and that you're using your white privilege. And I need you to shift to your marginalized place of being a woman so that we can have solidarity. Because when you work in your privilege, you keep climbing the ladder, you keep wanting power for yourself and what looks like you, which is white people, white women. But when you go back to that space of working from the woman with an X, then we are able to come together as women of you being a change agent, no longer ally, or really fighting for women, fighting for people of color. So that's what I've had to have serious conversations to address Karen.
Thank you. And if I may, I mean, that is exactly it. I think this is a huge part of the problem, is that white women want to reap the benefits of, you know, being a woman and you know, protection from gender discrimination, protection from wage gap, protection from sexual harassment. But then we go in there and take up all those goodies and turn our back on everybody else. And we don't understand, like we operate from such an ahistorical place. And the reason why I bring that up is that we think somehow that these workplace benefits that we have were won by feminists, but they weren't. They were won by Black people and Black women specifically in the civil rights movement. You know, we would not have any protection from workplace discrimination as white women in this country if Black people hadn't given their lives to fight for civil rights laws while we sat on the sidelines. I mean, some of us, you know, did engage, and some of us were active in the civil rights movement. Many of us were neutral and just not really paying attention. And some of us were hardcore anti-civil rights activists, like actively fighting the massive resistance. And like if our kids' school was going to be desegregated, we were out there with picket signs demanding that it remain segregated. And so, you know, 50 years later, Kimberly Crenshaw pointed this out in 1989, you know, that white women are the biggest beneficiaries of the anti-discrimination law, and we're not becoming the workplace advocates once we're in there. And in fact, we pretend like we don't even know what this history is. And I think going back even further, you know, last year we commemorated 400 years since British slave traders kidnapped the first Africans and brought them to Jamestown. And they were the first enslaved people in Jamestown, Virginia. But one thing that kind of slipped through the cracks is who came a few months later was a boatload full of white women, because the white men, settler colonialists, knew that they had to make this an intergenerational enterprise, and they needed to have white women in the mix to reproduce, to raise their children, to run their households, and to be kind of the glue that holds the whole system of white supremacy together. And so anyway, it all goes back to that. And I'm so glad that you started with that quote, Janice from Audre Lorde, who's very much like my shero and who I turn to constantly for inspiration and guidance. And I put in the chat one of my favorite articles by her, Age, Race, Sex, and Class, where she talks about, this is after we lost the Equal Rights Amendment. And she's talking about how white women are unable to relate across difference as equals. You know, we only know how to relate in hierarchy, but we don't know how to relate across difference as equals. And that is how we keep fighting the same battles over and over again and not hardly making any progress. And she says at the end, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So when white women do like what the president of your college is doing, and refuse to acknowledge our privilege, and refuse to listen, and refuse to cede our power, to sit down and make space for Black women to assume those positions of leadership, we're never going to win. This is exactly what the patriarchy wants. They want us to all hate ourselves, hate each other, and be disunited from each other. And that's why our progress is so slow. And we need each other. I mean, we need each. We're never going to win. There's no way to fight. The patriarchy will never concede its power unless we are united. That is the only way we can take them down.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Karen. I see Shaun had his hand up, and then I see Shannon. Shaun, did you want to take yourself off mute and just share your insights?
Yeah. Excuse my picture. I haven't been able to figure out why it looks like it's snowing in my house in this basement. Well, I've had this conversation a lot with women I'm friends with women of color that I'm friends with, particularly Black women, women that I've been in relationships with. The first thing I do when I have these conversations is I tread very carefully, and I acknowledge that, yes, there are white women. I remember a conversation in particular that I had with my friend Crystal when I was acknowledging her pain and, you know, her being a nurse working in healthcare and some of the things she's been through. And I told her, I said, listen, Crystal, yes, there are white women that will be in a relationship with me, that will sleep with me, but won't give you the time of day. I acknowledge that. And there's no but in this. I just think the key component is education. And I believe it starts with a lot of DEI experts that have positions within corporate America. I think that's one of the places it starts, because this work, it can't be about checking a box. It has to be about true education. So when like leaders like us actually have a chance to speak out, you know, that is part of the problem. You know, I don't know who acknowledges that or not, that when situations like this arise, you know, not being afraid to lose friends. And I understand we all got to, you know, pay bills and things of that nature. But another thing that I've noticed is that a lot of times people just want their pain, their struggle acknowledged. And when that's done, that's where the educational component comes in, that as far as, okay, listen, a lot of people just don't recognize the lens that they're looking through, or they're viewing the problem through, is a little skewered. So a lot of, I'm not gonna say a lot, but I've run into particular people that, you know, white women, that they really didn't realize that they were still kind of being offensive, or they were reaping privilege. And some of them, you know, they say one thing, but their actions, you know, speak to the contrary. So I'm kind of talking in circles, but I think that the major component is education, and just not being able to, like, it's one thing to speak out in spaces like this, but I mean, you know, and some of you are much more farther along in the work than I am, but what I have noticed is that a lot of times when there's an opportunity for tutelage, mentorship, education, you know, people do not speak out in those spaces. And I mean, rightfully so sometimes, because, you know, status, job, promotion down the line, things of that nature could be in jeopardy, being ostracized, things of that nature. But I definitely think that it's not always on them, because a person is only going to exhibit a mind state or a certain behavior, based on what they've known their whole life, so it's on us and people and advocates like us that when these situations occur, that no matter if you are the only one in a room that's going to speak up and say something, you have to speak up and say something then, and that's really truly the only way things are going to change, because a lot of these situations and a lot of these women that you're talking about that exhibit this type of behavior and mind state, some of them really, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are people that are very aware and very conscious of what they're doing, but some, like I said, they mean well, or some of them just, like straddle the fence. They're not supremacists, but so that's mine.
Thank you for sharing that, Shaun. And you pointed out something that I want to say really quickly before, because I'm trying to move along. I know we have some people who raised their hands. But so one thing that's really important to understand, and that I think as a Black woman, I would want white women to understand, is that the point that you made earlier about this idea of, because you date a Black person or because you have a Black child, that means you cannot be racist and you can't uphold systems of white supremacy and white privilege. And I think that that's absolutely false. And you could have good intentions, but you're still upholding systems of white supremacy. So I think that moving past that, or first of all, like recognizing that as a white person, you have white privilege is really, really important. And I think that even though we could be women, and as women, we share collective struggles. As a Black woman, I think what's a little bit frustrating sometimes for me is that I don't think that the struggles of non-white women are taken into consideration when we have this conversation. So I saw that, Shannon, you had your hand up, so I just wanted to allow you the opportunity to share.
Well, that's awesome. And it's also really great because my Black daughter is sitting here. So
that's awesome. Perfect segue.
It's awesome that you just said what you said, because I was like, I don't know if I should go on video or not, because I don't want anybody to think I'm showing you off, but she's interested in this conversation as well. I think the thing, Janice, if you can help me remember the question, it was like, how do we ensure that as women speak about the struggle of equality and, overcoming oppression, that we're, as white women, not necessarily congratulating ourselves for our progress, but inviting this conversation with a greater depth level of depth.
Yeah, absolutely. And that we're like including that, or taking into consideration the intersectionality piece. Yeah. Because I think we have a tendency to say, oh, as women, our struggles are the same. And we do have similar struggles as women, but we also have unique experiences. So how do we take those into consideration when we're having this conversation of gender equity?
Yeah, I can only share, I'm only as far down the path as I am, which is not that far. But one aha I had after I had delivered 12 or 13 speaking engagements and podcasts where I was asked to speak about gender equity or speak about creating our company's woman-owned and employee and woman-led and employee-owned. It was this aha moment, really way too late, when I realized that the first answer to the question, how did you get where you are today, needed to be privilege. And to shift that and correct that in those podcasts. And when I am asked that question, to say, first and foremost, my privilege, secondarily, these are some of the tactics and strategies that I deployed as a white woman that really are not necessarily available to everyone in the way that they were available to me.
Yeah, that acknowledgement piece is important, because I think until you acknowledge your white privilege, you're not going to be able to use it to help marginalized people. And I think there is this idea that having privilege means that you didn't work hard to get to where you're at. And so even just in the word privilege, people really fight against that. And they say, no, but I came from a disadvantaged background. I don't have privilege. I worked hard. I came from working class family. I was the first in my family to go to college. I did this, I did that. I don't have white privilege. I'm not one of those people. And it's like, recognizing actually and understanding what white privilege is. You could be of a working class family and as a white person, or a white adjacent person, or a person who can pass as white, you still have privilege. So I think that not acknowledging your white privilege inhibits you from being an effective ally, especially in the conversation of like gender equity. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Janice, me?
Yeah.
So I want to add to that, Janice, Shannon, that in addition to I got to where I am with my privilege, and this is how I'm using my privilege to ensure that folks who don't have my privilege are able to advance too. I think that is the second part of it, not just acknowledging our privilege, but actually how are we actively engaging to dismantle those systemic barriers by utilizing our privilege. And I'd like to, if I may, go back to something Shaun said. So on the one hand, and Audre Lorde said this too, like it is not the job of the oppressed to teach the oppressor how to stop oppressing them. And white women, we need to step up and call in our white women peers. Like we need to be the ones saying, hey, this is screwed up. What you are doing is screwed up, and not making it the job of Black women to educate us on what we are doing wrong, or for them to risk their jobs, their livelihood, especially in a context where the median net wealth of Black families is projected to be 0 by 2053. Are you going to be the one to say to your white woman boss, what you are doing is screwed up? Like, no, like who's going to take that kind of risk? And we shouldn't be putting people through that terrible stress. On the other hand, I grew up in a nearly all white community, okay? I grew up learning racism is terrible. Dr. Martin Luther King is wonderful. The way to not be racist is to be colorblind and to treat everybody the same, but never actually seeing anyone in my family do that, not intentionally, but because we didn't know any people of color. We lived in an all white community. So it was only through going to work for very diverse organizations, having women of color as my boss, and then later becoming a mentor to hundreds of young adults and developing those relationships and listening to their stories, that I came to understand, okay, everything I learned about race and racism growing up is harmful and inaccurate. And in fact, I am part of the problem. So I do think that the way that we learn is through interpersonal relationships and having that connection and sharing our stories. And that is so important. I live here in the Bay Area, a majority people of color region in a majority people of color state. But 9 times out of 10, if a white friend invites me to something, everybody there is white with a few Asian Americans. When my Black women friends invite me to something, I'm one of maybe 2 white women who are there. And I really do believe that sitting down and getting to know each other, especially getting to know each other outside of the workplace and the workplace power dynamics, and sharing those stories is really fundamental to figuring out what needs to change. And I'm not trying to justify white people's ignorance about racism. There is no reason why we should be ignorant about racism. But I will say this, I was extremely ignorant for many, many, many years of my life. And that is how this system is designed, to keep us in this place of ignorance.
Absolutely, Karen. And I see that Jessica, Janessa, and Barbie have their hand up. I just wanted to say really quickly, Brian made a really great point in the chat about differentiating between white privilege and white supremacy. In the work that I do, me personally, I know that a lot of people might not agree with this method, but there is a lot of white fragility that takes place. So even in the language that you use as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, I'm mindful of that. I do not use the word white supremacy because I think that the image is people in the KKK with white hoods is what people think of when they hear the word white supremacy. So when you call someone a white supremacist, it's that immediate, well, that's not me. I'm not a white supremacist. I'm colorblind. I grew up with Black friends. I dated a Black person. I this, I that. So I think that even in the language that we use, unfortunately, I understand that certain words will get people to disengage. So I try to use language when I'm having these conversations that invites people to the conversation. I know many people would disagree with me and say, you shouldn't modify the language to appease white feelings or to appease white people. But just in the line of work that I do, if a manager is not engaged with a workshop on white supremacy, you have to figure out how to sort of bring people into that conversation. So I personally think that recognizing the power of the language is important because a lot of people are going to disengage when you say you're upholding systems of white supremacy. I know that there's many people that may disagree with me, but I saw Jessica's hand up. Jessica, did you want to share?
Yeah, thank you. I read this book. It's called What Women of Color Need to Gain Their Seat at the Table. It's by Minda Hart. And in it, she talks about this notion, Karen, of talking about interpersonal relationships, right? Where it's like oftentimes when we enter a space, we don't realize that we have to create those kinds of relationships, right? We have to find our allies. We have to find our mentors. We have to find our sponsors. But that famous saying, closed mouths don't get fed, right? Essentially, you have to be unapologetically ambitious, and that's okay, and talk and say that and voice it, right? Like, oh, I just got, overlooked for a promotion. Well, did you apply? Right? So it's also, I created a guide that was published to everybody and at Berkeley, that's where I work, UC Berkeley. And it's essentially understanding your position as a person of color, right? What can you do? What kind of really competencies are you right? Do you need to be successful, right? What's the secret formula that Minda Hart talks about? And then, how can we really call out the allies? Like, I hate that term, really, to be honest, because that means nothing to me. It's not actionable. Like, what are you doing? Nothing. So I can't tell you enough how much I really appreciated her dialogue and what she talked about in her book. And one thing also I want to mention, I work really closely with our director of diversity, equity, inclusion, and I work with MBA students, right? So these are the future leaders, right? And it's a humbling experience, right? Because I am highly educated. I understand my privilege, right? I'm still first gen, whatever other kind of identities I have. When I walk into these spaces, I'm very educated when it comes to Chicano studies, right? I studied it, I breathe it, I teach it sometimes. But that doesn't mean I know your history, doesn't mean I know, the Black, the Indigenous. I have to walk into these spaces understanding that everybody has a certain level of understanding, right? There's always a space to educate yourself, right? And sometimes that's okay.
Yes. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Minda is my close friend and collaborator, and I just did her Secure the Seat Writers Retreat last weekend. It was absolutely fantastic. If you have the chance to read her book or to hear her speak, I highly, highly recommend it. One thing I will say is beware the white women in the workplace. Observe their behavior very, very closely before enlisting them to, quote, become your ally. I have experienced in the workplace sexual harassment, wage gap, glass ceiling from men, but by far the most harmful behavior I've experienced in the workplace have come from white women who were senior to me within the organization, approached me as friends and mentors, okay? And then I would confide in them and share in confidence the struggles I was experiencing. And then they would turn and use that against me because they viewed me as some kind of threat to their proximity to men in power. And meanwhile, I've had men in the workplace who were fantastic allies to me and who invested in my leadership development. I've also had the great fortune to work for many women of color who invested in me and really sought to develop me as a person and as a professional. And there's this scarcity mentality among many white women in the workplace that is extremely, I don't know, they're just, and I hate to sound, obviously I'm someone who preaches don't be biased, but it takes a lot of observation before I trust a white woman. I have to watch her for a long time. The second thing I wanted to say to Janice's point about how do we approach these conversations in workplace workshops, I think it's super important. We can't just have an unconscious bias workshop that is not rooted in history, okay? These biases did not come about by happenstance, okay? They were very intentionally created. There is a reason why we carry these stereotypes in our heads. And we have to acknowledge what that history is if we're ever going to actually work toward addressing overcoming our bias, because we have to talk about power, we have to talk about privilege, we have to talk about history, because that is how we got to where we are now. And we're never going to get rid of these biases without acknowledging who created them, why, who benefits from them, what harm they cause, and how we continue to perpetuate that to this day. And again, going back to something Shaun was saying, I think the fundamental education that needs to occur if we're going to end racism has to occur in the home. It has to occur, I call it the intergenerational transmission. So it is the white parents framing their kids' understanding of the world in the home that is upholding white supremacy. And that has to shift to end racism. When I talk about inspiring the anti-racist generation, what makes me hopeful is that 43% of millennials are people of color, 47% of Gen Z are people of color. So if we can reach and teach like 10% of the white people in those generations, we can have a majority anti-racist generation and actually, attain power and change the dynamics.
Absolutely. And like you said, Karen, in 2045, demographers say that around that time is going to be the first time we're going to have a non-white country majority. So I know that that's also scary for some people, and that has led to some of the white lash. But you bring up so many good points, and I want to touch on all of them. I love Minda, and I know that some of you were discussing or sharing her book, and Minda's amazing. Her book is amazing. For white women on this call who want to learn more about the experiences of women of color, I would encourage you to, I know I have it, I think I have it downstairs, but her book, The Memo, is amazing. And it helps you to see, it's kind of like the Lean In for women of color, what Lean In and Nice Girls Don't Get the Corner Office sort of got is missing. So I think that listening to women of color is so important. And I've heard the conversation being said, because Karen, you said it's important to understand and learn the history. And I think that that's so important. But in having discussions with people, sometimes the response is, well, that wasn't me. That was my great grandfather. Or I don't even know if, that didn't have anything to do with me. So why can't we just move forward? Sometimes that narrative is put forth, and why can't we just move forward? That wasn't me. We're all women. We're in this together. So I think that statements like that are problematic to the movement. And it's important to first listen to women of color, listen to Black, Indigenous women of color. And I think a failure to acknowledge what we've gone through in the history will continue to widen the gap between Black women and women and white women, or women of color and white women. So I think that the first part is the acknowledgement. And I think that that is so, so difficult for many, many white women. Just in my experiences, it's that acknowledgement, because you have to, there's shame and guilt that comes with acknowledging particularly the history of what has happened to Black people in this country. But I saw there were a few people who raised their hand. Janessa, I know you've had your hand up for a little while. Did you want to share?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And I think that the timing of Karen's last statement around rooting a lot of what we talk about in history, I think could not be more spot on. And so my role, my day job, I'm the global head of diversity and inclusion for an asset manager, right? So now we're talking Wall Street, we're working in finance. So there's a whole slew of dynamics involved in that. But when we're doing this work day to day, I've found, to the point that a couple of folks have made, that storytelling has been incredibly, incredibly powerful. I think Jessica, you mentioned it, Karen, you mentioned it, and Janice, you as well. One of the things that I have found is, when I can get in the room and talk to folks, especially white women, and talk about the fact that, when you look like me, we are trying to operate within a construct that was not built for us. It was not built to see people who look like me. And so when I read Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, right, which was, great book, and I fully respect everything that Sheryl has done, and we're, telling women that leaning in is the way to get a seat at the table. Well, leaning in isn't the issue for Black women, right? But I have to tell that story because they may not have people maybe in their personal lives, they're not getting this narrative somewhere else, right? The research will show that we tend to live with ourselves, right? We run in pretty homogenous social circles, all of us. So a lot of the time where we'll get that convergence of difference is the workplace. So the work that's happening in the workplace is so critical, because some folks, that's where they get their dose of diversity, right? Sometimes it's even on the commute into work, right? Being in New York City, that's where you'll see the difference. You'll have rich, poor, Black, white, gay, straight, all of us on the subway. That's where you're getting your dose of diversity. So these conversations happening in the workplace are just more and more important, and being able to tie it to the history. When folks talk about, we're celebrating, the ratification of the 19th Amendment this year. Well, I couldn't vote then, right? I couldn't vote until 65 when the Voting Rights Act happened, right? Because so it's not the same. And I think it's really just because folks just have different lived experiences, right? That's really what it is. If we do live in homogenous worlds, their circle looks like them. They may not look like me. So I think where we can, and again, it comes back to sometimes that lead coat that people of color will wear when we have to be the ones to constantly teach. I don't know if that'll ever stop. I really don't know if it can ever stop if we really do want to see a change. So I would urge us all, where we can, just bring the history into the conversation, bring your own story into the conversation, let them know that it's a space for them to learn about our experience, because it is quite different than their experience, and talk about privilege, right? There's going to be times where if we're at an HBCU, my privilege is going to help you. I'm going to help you be relevant if we're at an HBCU at a career fair or something, right? It can totally differ. But I think that's where we will start to see some of that change, where we let down some of that guard, we let some folks in, but it has to go both ways. It can't always be me teaching. There has to be some reciprocity there. So but I just had to echo that point. I think the storytelling is critical. It's been really critical in the work that I do day to day, dealing with senior leaders, our board, our clients. But that's the only way things will change. We have to be willing to keep telling the story. So I appreciate the comments here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janessa. That was storytelling, is so important. And to your point, when we're coming in, I know many of us do racial equity work, diversity and inclusion work. When I do a workshop, I don't say, you have white privilege, you're a white supremacist, because that's gonna again shut people down. But when I tell a story about, hey, there was a time that I got stopped by police, or I was jogging and the police thought I was running away or committing a crime or doing this, that helps people to connect better than, you know, saying, hey, you're a white supremacist. While that could be very, very true, in my experiences, that has led people to sort of just shut down. And I think that the storytelling aspect is so, so important, because people are able to put themselves in your shoes when they're visualizing the story that you're telling them. Like, I still hear people saying, how could this, you know, in regards to Ahmaud Arbery, people saying, how could this happen, is like really mind-boggling to me. But again, if you're in your siloed communities, you don't understand the lived experiences of Black people. So I could see how you could say, how could this happen? You have no idea how Black people are victimized and treated in this country. So storytelling is really pivotal. I saw, Barbie, that you had your hand up. Did you want to share?
I did. Can you guys hear me? Okay,
Yes.
good. I had to retreat. Hey, Karen, how are you?
Good.
Good. I had to retreat to the basement because the kids were loud. Just a quick comment, and I think Janice touched on it a little bit at her last comment, saying that the first step is to acknowledge that there's white privilege. I just want to speak from, I guess, a perspective that I don't often hear discussed when we talk about white women and how we want them to be allies and recognize their privilege and kind of shift their thinking. I think we have to recognize, as Black women, for them, it's a deep dive. It's an emotional journey, because it's stripping away everything that they've ever known to be true about the way they think about Black women, and actually rewiring. So you're kind of telling them, you've done something wrong. This is, you know, not the way you should be thinking. You should be doing it this way. And I think sometimes, I'm not saying take on their pain and be sympathetic and empathetic. No, you can be I guess a partner in that. Like, it's not our responsibility to shift their view or their thinking of their privilege, but I do think we have to understand that it's not an overnight type of thing. This takes some introspection and undoubtedly some, well, why am I thinking like this? Well, where did I get that thought process from? And I know I'm echoing some of the things that people have said before, but you just can't, it's telling a whole subgroup of people to change their thinking and stick up for them. That's like putting all white women in a basket and tossing them in the ocean in hoping that they can swim. And I think Jessica said that she doesn't like the term ally. At one point, I heard somebody say the same thing, and they suggested the term accomplice, because an accomplice actually does something, actually has some type of action. So I just think while we expect there to be a change, we need to recognize that it's not going to be overnight. And it's conversations like these that are going to have to continue to happen, with a little bit of understanding on our part that this is like real change for people, real thought shifts, real reasoning, real everything. You know, some people hold so fast to their beliefs because, like somebody said before, that's the way they were raised. So you're asking folks to completely change that around. And, you know, white women, you can start by, you know, sticking up for us if you're in a room that we're not in. You know, you don't have to sing our praises, but hey, just mention, hey, well, have you thought about Barbie? You know, has she been invited to this? Is she aware of this? I think she has valuable things to offer. So, I mean, that's a starting point after you kind of acknowledge the fact that, hey, yeah, my privilege is kind of taking over here. So that's my short comment. I can go on and on, but I really like to understand and to try and give people the benefit of the doubt, and not, because I put myself in a white woman's shoes, and if I were to just hear, you got white privilege, you got white privilege, you got white privilege, which is true, but then it's like, you got white privilege, and then the cold shoulder, you know, there's something that's missing there, that, and I don't know what it is, but maybe somebody else can chime in. And
Barbie, I love the point that you're making. You know, because it's not only like when you hear I have white privilege, or it not only feels like I'm being, quote, attacked, but my whole family, like everything, you know, the people that I love the most, my grandparents, you know, my church, like all these things that I have identified with, my early childhood teachers, everything that has been taught to me about what is good and right in the world is now being defined as wrong.
Right.
It can be a little bit, you know, it is shocking, and it can be upsetting. I mean, the feeling of white fragility is real. There's like, there's kind of a tension there. Is it justified? No, you know,
right.
We have to work through that. That is a historical fact. Going to your point about storytelling, in my workshops, I put up a portrait of my great grandfather, and I talk about how he got off the boat from France, made his way to Western Nebraska, and acquired 160 acres of land that he paid $60 for in 1888. You know, who else, first of all, whose land was that? And what had happened to them for him to be able to go there and purchase that land from the government? And then who else could have benefited from that land at that time and did not have access to it? And why was he given access to it? Well, he was given access to it because he was white, because he was Protestant, because he was a man, and because he made his way over there. And that's what qualified him to become an American. That piece of property is still in my family. It is the foundation of my mother's college education, my mother being a homeowner. It's the foundation of my college education, my being a homeowner. That one transaction set up, you know, all my cousins, all of us, to be where we are today. And that is the origin of our privilege. Now, does this make my great grandfather a horrible person? No, I'm sure that if I were him, I would have done the exact same thing. I mean, this is where it gets into this judgment about like who is good and who is bad. It gets very, very sensitive, you know, but this is a historical fact. This is what people did during this time period. And so if you're aware of this, what that means is, what are you going to do with it going forward? I can't go back and like rectify that. Right. What I can is utilize what I have to push for reparations, to do reparations privately, to do all that I can to spend down my privilege and make sure that folks who didn't have access to that intergenerational wealth building are able to access and grow wealth, or that we change our whole economic system and have it become more equitable. But it's not a judgment. I'm not a horrible person because of this. I didn't have anything to do with it, you know? I'm just who I am now. And now that I'm aware of it, I got to do something about it.
Right.
Absolutely, Karen. And it's important to recognize that like having privilege or having white privilege doesn't make you a bad person, but acknowledging and recognizing that you do have the privilege and not doing anything about it or with it, then you know, you could say you're a bad person, or you're not using your privilege, or you're not being an effective ally. I saw that Mira had her or his hand up, so I wanted to allow you an opportunity to share your thoughts, Mira.
So, hi, thank you. I'm really loving hearing everyone's contributions and questions so far. Specifically appreciate you know, the continued call for us white folks to do the work of collecting fellow white people and doing that education work. And I think the question I'm kind of constantly coming back to in my own anti-racist like education and journey and organizing is how to do that work without stepping on folks of color's toes who are also like facilitators, trainers, organizers in that field. And I know everyone, of course, has a different answer or approach, right? But really curious for y'all to both kind of, elaborate on your thoughts and basically like what's our place.
So I'll speak as a Black racial equity, diversity, and inclusion facilitator. I think it's absolutely necessary for there to be white facilitators who are speaking to white people, because as much as I can read and try to understand the mindset of a white person, I will never understand that because I'm not white. So I do think that there is that necessity for white people who are doing the work. I know that some of my colleagues of color, I've read some of their feedback and I've seen them say things like, there should not be white people doing racial equity work because you're profiting off of the backs of Black people, people of color, Indigenous people. Me personally, I'm not of that mindset. I think that white people are necessary because it's kind of like, get your people, you got to get your people. So that's why I personally think that there are white people that are necessary to do the work. And then I commend the white people that are recognize their privilege and are using their privilege to speak out and to have the backs of Black, Indigenous people of color. So that's kind of my mindset about it. I don't know if Karen, you wanted to share how you feel about it.
Yeah, so similarly, you know, some of the people who I respect the most don't believe that white people should be doing this work at all, believe it should only be done by Black and Indigenous women of color anti-racism educators. But I think that the task at hand is so monumental. We need everybody has a role to play. And what I think my role is in the outreach and the awareness and the reaching people who will listen to me in a way that they would have a very difficult time listening to you, but not that they get stuck with me, but that from me, they go to you, and then they go to another anti-racism educator, and they just keep moving along in the continuum to get deeper and deeper in the work. Like there's no way I have learned so much from amazing Black and Indigenous women of color anti-racism educators. There's no way I could impart or in any way take the place of what they have taught me. There's no way that I could do that. However, I know that there are many, many white women who I can reach and engage in a way and bring them along. And that's what I see my role as doing. And I'm going to keep doing this until, you know, for the rest of my life. This is my life's purpose. This is what I was sent to this planet to do.
Absolutely. And I see that Clara has her hand up. Did you want to share?
Hi, thank you so much. Another great call, ladies. This is amazing. And goodness, I'm sitting here like, oh, I wish there was a part 2. I hope there can be a part 2.
Yeah, we got to do a part 2.
Absolutely. This is so powerful. I really just wanted the question that was posed about what can be done for dominant members of the dominant group, racial group, and kind of the intersectional group of white women, particularly due to help in this space, or at least that's how I understood the question. I know in my role that I had as far as being a diversity, inclusion, and equity practitioner and leader, it was really helpful for anyone that was in a position of power, influence, who had a voice, and who had access to the rooms and the tables in the rooms where I wasn't even invited a lot of the time, to help me gain that exposure that I probably would not have had if they hadn't brought me with them. And it's not to say that I can't hold my own, I can't do my own thing, or make the necessary relationships so that I can have a voice in the room. But I think sometimes that initial access and that exposure, that third element of the pie construct, performance, image, exposure, is really, I find myself partnering with members of dominant groups for that exposure piece so that you can have a greater audience, a wider audience, and you can be seen as a partner. And as someone put so eloquently in the chat, about allyship being action. So I just wanted to kind of share that because I think that's something that's an immediate action that can be taken.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Clara. As a Black woman, what I would like to see done, and I think people evade the question, and I understand the mindset that it's not up to Black, Indigenous people of color to tell you how to be an ally. But what I would, as one Black woman, would like is the acknowledgement and recognition of your privilege. And then I would ask you to think about the ways in which you're supporting Black, Indigenous, women of color in your everyday life. So are you attending events that are being hosted by Black, Indigenous, women of color? I know that Dr. Nika White is present in this conversation, and she hosts every Friday. She has, I think they're called intentional conversations or something along those lines, but she has those. Are you attending events that are hosted by women of color and women from different groups? And thank you for putting that in the chat, Dr. White. Are you speaking out for and against white supremacy? Are you speaking out for Black, Indigenous women of color? Are you sharing books like Minda Hart's book, The Memo? Are you sharing stories that are written by different types of women? So thinking about all of those things, and how are you using your privilege in your everyday life, and what opportunities do you have that other people don't have, and what are you doing about that, is an important question to think about. But to be respectful to everyone's time, I think we're going to wrap up. And my apologies, because I know that there were a few people that had their hands up, but I always like to be respectful of people's time. And I definitely think, Karen, we need to do like a part 2, because there's a lot of info in the chat that I don't think we got to. But thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in on the conversation. Karen, did you have any final words before we wrap up?
I did put a link. I'm doing a conversation on self-care in the midst of chaos with Cecile Armstrong on Thursday, and I'd love for folks to join us for that. Thank you so much for creating this space, Janice. You're one of my all-time favorite people. And I have to add, Janice created my Coffee Meets Bagel profile. I may have met someone on there, Janice. So.
Yeah. Yay, that's exciting. I'm really happy. I'll have to text you about that afterwards. But yeah, it was so great to have this conversation with you, Karen. And thank you all so much for joining in. We'll have to do schedule a part 2. But I hope you all got an opportunity to connect with each other on LinkedIn, and we have to all make sure that we connect so that we can continue the conversation. So without further ado, have a nice night. We're actually gonna share the video. Karen and I will share this video in case you all wanted to share with anyone, but without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting, and I hope you all have a wonderful night.
Thank you.